We're increasing our aid by a third with additional support of £10 million. A serious humanitarian crisis is ongoing, and we have to respond by supporting the Palestinian people because they are also victims of Hamas. Shock and anger in Israel that reminds us of the emotions in the United States after September 11th, which has provoked American solidarity and strength. It has also led to a war against terrorism with some mistakes and self-destructive. Israel may be on the same dangerous path.
That's just two of the countless calls for Israeli restraint received from the country they call their most trusted partner after the country suffered the October 7th attack from Hamas. Indeed, even if it's thousands and tens of thousands of kilometers away and doesn't care about anything called humanitarian, it is not hard to imagine the darkest prospect that can happen not only to a Jewish government suffering the flames of hatred but also to the fate of all humanity that no one wants. Let's get to what has happened since October 10th. The Israeli army has been conducting an operation named Iron Sword. The multi-purpose fighters have attacked any target they believe has a Hamas presence under the Jewish regime. At the same time, the blockade and cuts in supplies to Gaza. A comprehensive attack with the participation of most Israeli forces has begun to be planned. On the other side of the ocean, the United States, Israel's ally, has a voice in the Middle East. Instead of voicing things like, "War is bad, don't fight, buddy," wherever there is no need for war. They send ammunition and weapons to allies and warn opponents not to take advantage of the situation, sending the USS Gerald R. Ford to the Mediterranean to support Israel and deter armed groups in the region. Washington announces the addition of the aircraft carrier USS Eisenhower to the USS Gerald R. Ford, an American task force that has begun to coordinate with Israel to support intelligence and plan a counterattack on Hamas. Across the Iranian front line, calling on the Muslim and Arab countries to cooperate against Israel and stop the Jewish government from killing Palestinians. Iran and Hezbollah have previously warned that fighting around the Gaza Strip could escalate into a regional conflict, but that stirs up Israel's determination to take revenge, which says it is ready for a joint offensive on land and in the air in response to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It is known that on October 15th, they attacked more than 250 targets across the Gaza Strip, including Hamas military headquarters and the Palestinian Islamic War Movement. The IDF also claimed that their ground aircraft killed Mirab Abu Murad, one of the Hamas commanders responsible for the October 7th attack. In the European Union, the views of its members were very divided, condemning Hamas terrorist acts, but some countries, such as France and Spain, were also disappointed with the decision to attack civilian targets in spite of Israeli international law. However, Hamas has the advantage of knowing the terrain in Gaza well and improving it for a long time in preparation for confrontation with Israelis. They also often use the tactics of hiding weapons and soldiers in civilian areas and moving unexpected attacks from these places. This is also the reason for Israel's partially extreme reaction to not hesitating to attack even civilian targets that they believe have a presence of Hamas militants, despite the fact that this could cause casualties to innocent people. The scope of the war was widened when, on October 12, Israel simultaneously launched rocket attacks against two major airports in Damascus and the northern Syrian city of Aleppo. After that, Syria has deployed air defense forces in response to the attack. Islamic nations like Iran can totally attribute it to genocide of Muslims, calling Arab nations taking measures against Israel. An ally on behalf of the US, Turkey, is also capable of intervening. If the worst conflict is the situation of Syrian government troops or a group of militias entering Israel following the Iranian assault movement. So far, you may have imagined the terrible prospect that we have just mentioned. We all have a responsibility to respond. This is the reaction of Iran's supreme leader to the most extreme way to blow up the war against Israel again in the Middle East. If the conflict here turns into a total war with nations at risk of extinction, all humanitarian rules will be abolished, all aimed at a final victory. In that perspective, the Islamic forces could use the tactics of isolating Israel instead of attacking and was defeated, because Israel failed to sustain a prolonged conflict because the majority of its troops were reserve forces withdrawn from the labor force. It also means that the Jewish opponent can be delighted every time the IDF gets more and more, because every time, Israel loses a fraction of its already scarce labor force. Look at the map on the screen of Israel right next to the territory of hostile Muslim nations right now. Saudi Arabia, although being influenced by the US, also refuses to normalize relations with Israel, unlike the isolated nations of the past, such as Iran, Russia, China, or even the southern Atlantis. Israel, which is unable to tolerate isolation for not too long. The small desert-shaped territory that occupies most of Israel even now imports most of its food and oil and relies on exports to balance spending and maintain growth. That's one of the main reasons why Israel has never engaged in any war more than a month since the 1948 War of Independence. For Iran, the situation has become more difficult because Israel is not bordered by Iranian territory, so the IDF has long planned a major attack, and Iran is almost impossible. If they do not succeed in the strategy of destroying the enemy in a short time, they will have to fall into defense and become increasingly deprived. It's clear that the military forces can focus their attacks on the deadly weakness of every outward path that leads to Israel. More worrying is the case that Arab nations massively encircle Israel, attacking to move in Israel slowly. A year is too long for Israel. If all these threats converge, Israel will not stand still, but will have to deal with everything they have first. The resources that have been stored, including from abroad, will be urgently recalled to the country for war. All in order to attack all the surrounding armies as in the Six-Day War. If they do not win the overwhelming victory in time and the Allies do not provide direct support, they will be forced to activate the nuclear trio, forming an endless war with the defense of atomic bombs and small-scale nuclear warheads that will hit the enemy's nation. Thereafter, at least 4 Dolphin submarines will receive the command to fight an Apo-PE turbo cruise missile carrying a nuclear warhead with enough range to reach any major city in the Arab bloc. Finally, when nothing worse could happen, Israel's trump card had to fight. That is the Jewish Jericho 3 ballistic missile with a range of 6,500 kilometers carrying a 750 kilograms nuclear warhead that will be sent to visit any country in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Europe which they believe is responsible for the danger of their nation's destruction. But the likelihood of such a scenario becoming a reality is extremely small. Modern nations tend to provoke potential opponents to attack each other or participate when they have nearly won, and no one wants to be the trigger of war or conflict when the interests are unclear. Otherwise, the Islamic world's leading powers such as Iran, if they want to destroy Israel in any way, even in the case of the entire lives of their sponsored soldiers, except causing the country itself to suffer irreversible damage. The United States is also trying to prevent the worst from happening. The superpower's remarkable move is to deploy a 26th Marine Corps, a special force capable of carrying out multiple missions to the Middle East. Some allies like Britain are also willing to intervene if necessary. Clearly, it would be partially superfluous if the target was just Hamas or even a front other than Hezbollah. But considering the risk of the parties taking advantage of the situation to interfere in the war of this Jewish nation, it is still a very logical step in parallel with which the deployment of aircraft carrier combat groups is also seen as a U.S. warning signal to the Iranian opponent for the price to pay if they act uncontrollably, so American measures are judged to be only deterrent and to keep the situation from getting worse. The prospects we've just mentioned are at a very small risk of occurrence, and the Israeli people are not very happy with the second situation either, which is the case of the IDF falling into the battle against the 2 Hamas and Hezbollah forces supported by Iran. If we look at the overall strength of Hamas, there are less than 10,000 fighters, including Hezbollah, with 100,000 soldiers armed with a variety of modern weapons such as high-precision drones. They are neither Israel's opponents in a conventional war, but in an unconventional war, things are completely different. Even in the foreseeable future, the Israeli Defense Forces are also struggling in front of the threat of attacks from the Hamas underground city. Well, that's the very huge and complex tunnel system that has been built over the years, despite the constant attempts by Israel and its allies to destroy. According to some sources, these tunnels, which are 500 kilometers long, while the size of the entire Gaza Strip is only 40 by 12 kilometers, they've been dug at different levels, up to 35 meters deep. Some of the tunnels have secret exits to neighboring Egypt, where Hamas weapon and ammunition are located. There are communications with wind and light systems powered by automatic generators. The hidden entrances of this underground maze are usually located in residential buildings or other public buildings. Israel's failure to strike at a more intense intensity will not guarantee the destruction of Hamas as it is claimed, but if it continues to infiltrate the Arabs, Hamas's intention is also seen as partly successful in turning the Jewish nation back on many countries around the world, especially in countries with hostile Muslim communities that have more reason to attribute to Israel genocide plots and attempts to ignore the Hamas-led attack on October 7. Gaza is home to countless armed groups of Palestinians. These organizations don't have human resources or heavy weapons like Hamas, but they're crowded enough to provoke severe battle in the streets. The Hezbollah front opened with the widespread involvement of modern Iranian-made drones, despite the US threat that Israel could suffer heavy losses. Even the Jewish army destroyed a large number of Hezbollah soldiers. This organization can also rely on extremely abundant supplies to survive while hiding in the civilian community and maintaining long-term harassment of Israel, an ultimate goal of which is to continuously erode Israel and not leave it at peace. In the Middle East, the United States has also repeatedly spoken out calling for Israel to exercise restraint. Even though they cannot abandon Israel at this time, it is clear that it is still urgent to put resources into surrounding China and then Ukraine in order to deal with Russia. More. So what is the Israeli military doing to stop these two terrible dangers from happening, where the Middle East is going? In front of us, we can only look at the sides like the US and Iran, and the ultimate victory can only depend on the one with the most practical action, not the one crying the loudest or tapping the keyboard the strongest.
Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this video. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our videos and much more. Click on the screen to watch another thrilling video. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next one. Take care.